You get handed $100 out of nowhere. Doesn't matter how it happens. A birthday card, a tax refund, a scratch-off ticket that actually paid out for once. What you do with it in the next 10 seconds says more about who you are than almost anything else could. Say you're 65. That 100 goes toward the electric bill, or maybe a nice dinner out because the house is paid off and the retirement account has decades of compounding behind it. You've already won the long game. $100 is just $100. Say you're 35 instead. That 100 gets split 3 ways in your head before it even leaves your hand. A chunk toward the mortgage that still keeps you up at night. A chunk toward daycare. And if there's anything left over, maybe it goes into the market. You're not broke. You're just stretched thin in every direction at once. Now, say you're 22. That 100 goes straight into an app on your phone. 3 taps and it's already sitting inside a Roth IRA. Or split across a few fractional shares of something you saw trending that morning. No mortgage yet, no kids yet. Just momentum and the strange, borrowed confidence of someone who started early without fully knowing why. 3 people, same $100. 3 completely different relationships with money. None of it chosen, just the decade each of them happened to be born into. So here's the real question. If you had to bet on which one of these 3 is actually winning right now, not who has the most, but who's making the smartest move, you'd probably bet on the one with the most zeros. You'd be wrong. And by the end of this video, you're going to know exactly why. That's not a trick question, and it's not clickbait. It's the actual argument this whole video is going to make, start to finish. Because the way you've been taught to compare generations is broken from the first assumption. You already know the fight. Boomers had it easy. Millennials got crushed by 2008. Gen Z can't stop buying coffee and avocado toast. All comparison, no context. And it always ends the same way, with you deciding your own generation got screwed the worst. That's not what you're getting here. You're getting 3 specific things, looked at honestly, one at a time, with real numbers behind each one. First, housing. Because for most people, owning a home is still the single biggest wealth-building move you can realistically make. And the gap between who owns and who doesn't has never been this stark. Second, retirement savings. Because your balance tells you where you stand right now, but it doesn't tell you where you're actually headed. And those 2 things get confused constantly. Third, investing behavior, not account size, but the habits underneath it. Because your habits, more than your starting balance, tend to predict where you'll end up 20 years down the road. Boomers, Millennials, Gen Z, same 3 people from that $100 moment, except now you're going to see the actual numbers behind their decisions instead of just guessing at them. And here's the promise, none of this is going to be the answer you're expecting. Not because the data is secretly rigged in some surprising direction, but because winning was never really about who has the most money sitting in an account today. It's really about trajectory, and trajectory is a lot harder to see than a bank balance, which is exactly why almost nobody ever talks about money this way. So who actually got the head start? Let's start with the biggest one, the thing that still builds more wealth for more people than almost anything else. A house. Still, for most people, the single biggest lever there is. Here's where things stand right now, according to Redfin's research on generational homeownership. Baby boomers own homes at a rate of 79.9%. Millennials sit at 55.4%, a number that's actually been climbing steadily the last couple of years. And Gen Z, the youngest adults in this comparison, are at 27.1%. On the surface, that looks obvious. Of course, older people own more homes. They've had more decades to save, more time in the workforce, more chances to buy before prices went the way they did. Age explains a huge chunk of that gap, and honestly, that part isn't controversial at all. But here's where it gets interesting, and here's the comparison that actually matters most. Instead of looking at everyone today, at every age, look at people the exact same age, just decades apart from each other. Take a 28-year-old. Right now, in this economy, 38.3% of 28-year-old Gen Zers already own a home. Compare that to baby boomers, who, when they themselves were 28, owned homes at a rate of 44.4%. Same age, completely different decade. A 6-point gap that has nothing to do with effort and everything to do with timing. And millennials, when they were 28, they actually came in even lower than Gen Z is sitting right now, around 36.8%. Which means, strange as it sounds, Gen Z is technically tracking slightly ahead of where millennials stood at that exact same age, at least by this one measure. Sit with that for a second. The generation everyone assumes is furthest behind is, at this specific age-adjusted marker, doing marginally better than the generation directly before them. So the honest headline here isn't "Boomers won, everyone else lost." It's that boomers bought into a housing market that simply doesn't exist anymore. Lower prices relative to income, far less competition, none of today's bidding wars. Millennials got hit hardest by timing, catching the 2008 crash right as they were supposed to be buying their first homes. And Gen Z is entering an expensive, brutal market, but with slightly better timing than the generation that came directly ahead of them. None of that means the housing race is settled. It just means the real story is messier and far more interesting than old people simply had it easy. But owning the house is only half the story. The other half is who actually helped each generation get there. And that part says even more. Here's the part nobody puts on a bar chart. How you got the down payment changes how you feel about the home once you're actually standing inside it. According to LendingTree's 2026 survey on mortgage down payments, 40% of all current homeowners got some kind of financial help buying their home. That's already up from a few years ago. But split that number by generation, and it stops looking like one shared trend and starts looking like three completely different experiences. Among Gen Z homeowners, 78% got help from family. Millennials, 56%. Baby boomers, just 12%. Boomers, for the most part, bought their first homes without leaning on their parents at all, because for their generation, that simply wasn't the norm. Gen Z, overwhelmingly, never had that option to begin with. And here's where it stops being just a financial stat and turns into an identity one. Among people who got that help, 46% said they mostly felt grateful. Reasonable, on the surface. Grateful is the response most people would expect. But 21% of Gen Z recipients admitted they felt embarrassed about needing it. More than double the 9% of millennials who said the same thing. Think about what that actually means. The exact same act, a parent stepping in to help their kid buy a home, lands completely differently depending on when you happen to be born. For a boomer's parents, it barely happened at all. For a millennial, it's simply help, no real shame attached to it. For Gen Z, it's increasingly the default way in, and still, somehow, carries a quiet sting underneath the gratitude. So the house numbers from a minute ago aren't just about who owns and who doesn't. They're about who had to ask for help to get there and who never had to ask at all. That's status. That's identity. And it's quietly shifting underneath the surface of every spreadsheet you just looked at. Which brings us to the one number that actually shows whether any of this evens out over time, generation to generation: retirement. Retirement, though, is where you'd expect the story to finally make sense. More years working should mean more money saved. Simple math, no surprises there. You clock in more decades, you walk away with more money. And for the most part, that's exactly what the numbers show. According to Fidelity's retirement analysis, the average boomer has $270,800 sitting in their 401k right now. Gen X, one generation behind that, averages $222,100. Millennials come in noticeably lower than both of them, at $83,700. And Gen Z, still early in their careers, average just $17,900. Lay those four numbers next to each other, and you get a staircase, dropping hard at every single step. Boomers to Gen X, a gap of about $48,000. Gen X to Millennials, the biggest drop of all, nearly $140,000. Millennials to Gen Z, another steep fall. On paper, that looks almost exactly like what you'd expect from decades of compounding quietly doing what compounding does. But a balance only tells you part of the story. The other part is savings rate. How much of your paycheck you're actually setting aside right now, today, regardless of how much you've already built up over the years. Boomers save at 17.1% of income. Gen X, 15.4%. Millennials, 13.5%. Gen Z, 11.3%. Same staircase shape again, with older generations saving a larger share of their income than younger ones. Which makes sense too, at least on the surface. Boomers are closer to retirement, so naturally they're pushing harder to catch up before the finish line finally arrives. Here's where it gets more complicated though. A savings rate is only a snapshot of right now. It doesn't tell you how long someone's actually been at it, how early they started, or what habits they quietly built before that number was ever measured. A 22-year-old saving 11% of a modest starting salary and a 60-year-old saving 17% of a peak salary are not living the same financial reality, even though one number simply looks bigger than the other. So the balance gap makes total sense on its face. Boomers have had roughly 40 extra years of compounding that Gen Z simply hasn't had time to accumulate yet. Nobody with any sense is seriously arguing otherwise here. But if balance were the entire story, this video would end right here, with the obvious answer. Boomers simply win, everyone else loses, case closed, absolutely nothing more to see here. It isn't the entire story though, because balance isn't the same thing as behavior, and behavior, not the number sitting in an account today, is exactly what determines where each of these staircases actually ends up years from now. So if balance isn't the same thing as behavior, what actually is? And how do you even measure something as fuzzy as behavior in the first place? Here's the number that flips this entire video on its head. The one piece of data that changes everything you just heard about balances and staircases. A Vanguard study looked at who's actually on track to retire successfully, not who has the most saved right now, but who's genuinely likely to have enough, given how they're currently behaving. Gen Z, the generation with by far the smallest 401k balance of anyone we've talked about so far, came out on top of the entire ranking. 47% of Gen Z workers are currently on track to maintain their lifestyle in retirement. Millennials came in a bit lower, at 42%, Gen X, 41%, and Boomers, despite having by far the biggest balance of the group, landed lowest of all, at just 40%. Read that again, slowly, because it genuinely doesn't sound like it should be true. The generation with $17,900 saved is statistically more likely to end up fine than the generation sitting on $270,800. That's not a typo. And it's not the study getting it backwards. It's what happens the moment you stop measuring a snapshot and start measuring a trajectory instead. Gen Z is starting small, but starting early, saving consistently and riding decades of compounding they haven't even gotten to experience yet. Boomers built an enormous balance over long, steady careers, but a meaningful chunk of them are approaching retirement without quite enough runway left to close the gaps that opened up somewhere along the way. Gaps a bigger balance alone can't always paper over. This is the actual twist buried underneath this whole video. The one the cold open at the very start was quietly building toward the entire time. Winning was never really about the number sitting in an account today. It's about the direction that number is heading and how much time it has left to keep moving in that direction. Which means, going back to that $100 moment from the very beginning, the 22-year-old dropping it straight into a Roth IRA might genuinely be making the smartest move of all three people in that scene, even while holding the smallest amount of money of anyone in that opening scene, at least for right now. So why is Gen Z's trajectory actually shifting? Not just vibes, not just a generation collectively deciding to be more responsible out of nowhere, on its own, with no outside push. There's an actual law sitting quietly behind part of this. It's called Secure 2.0, and one specific piece of it changed the default setting for millions of workers. Starting January 1st, 2025, any new 401k or 403b plan set up by an employer has to automatically enroll eligible employees at a starting contribution rate between 3 and 10% of their pay. And it doesn't stop there. Every year after that, the rate has to climb by at least 1% until it reaches somewhere between 10 and 15%. Employees can still opt out at any point. Nobody is forced to save against their will, but the default flipped completely. Before, you had to actively choose to start saving. Now, at any newly created plan, you have to actively choose to opt out of saving. That single switch, from opt-in to opt-out, is one of the most well-documented behavioral nudges in personal finance, because most people simply stick with whatever the default is. Here's why that matters for this video specifically. Millennials came into the workforce mostly under the old opt-in system. Gen Z is aging into the workforce right as this new opt-out default becomes normal. That's not the whole reason Gen Z showed up ahead in that Vanguard on-track number from a minute ago. Habits, timing, and starting age all played a part too, but it's a real structural piece of it, not just a coincidence. Worth being precise here, this only applies to new plans, not every existing one. Plenty of older employers are exempt, so the shift is gradual, not universal, and it's still unfolding as more companies fall under it over time. Still, the direction is clear. The system itself is starting to build the habit in automatically, which brings up the last and most personal question of all. Does any of this actually change what you should do with your own money? Here's the honest answer. Maybe not much. At least, not in the way you were probably expecting. You can't rewrite the decade you happen to be born into. You can't force a housing market to suddenly be cheaper than it is, and you can't force a law like Secure 2.0 to have existed 10 full years earlier than it actually did. None of that is truly in your control. But rewind, just for a second, back to that $100 moment from the very start of this video. 3 people, holding the exact same amount of money, 3 completely different reactions, shaped almost entirely by circumstances none of them actually chose. If you were betting on the balance alone, you'd have picked the 65-year-old. Biggest number by far, decades of compounding, house completely paid off. And by that measure, sure, they're ahead, today, right now, in this specific moment. But the 22-year-old, the one with the smallest amount of money and the least experience of the three, they're building something the balance sheet doesn't capture yet. An early start, a consistent habit, decades of runway still sitting patiently ahead of them. Statistically, that's the exact profile most likely to end up fine. So, honestly, who actually won that $100 moment back at the start? It depends entirely on when you're asking. Snapshot today, boomer. Trajectory over time, quite possibly Gen Z instead. And the honest, slightly frustrating truth is that neither answer is technically wrong. They're just quietly measuring two completely different things. Here's the one pattern that showed up across every single generation we looked at in this video, regardless of birth year or current balance. In the data, an earlier start tended to matter more than a bigger one, and steady habits tended to matter more than occasional big moves. That's true whether you're 22 or 65, whether you're starting with $100 or $100,000, whether the market treats your generation kindly or not. So here's a question for you, genuinely. Which one of these three generations do you think is actually ahead right now? Drop your age in the comments, and I'll tell you honestly where the data says you stand. If this kind of breakdown was useful to you, there is more like it coming. Real numbers, no fluff, generation by generation, one honest comparison at a time. Stick around for the next one.